The blizzard had teeth. That was the only way Daniel Cross could describe the wind that was tearing across the high country, transforming the afternoon into a hell's cape of white and cold. He'd been caught in weather before. 30 years on the frontier had taught him to recognize when conditions were survivable and when they were not. But this storm felt personal, felt designed specifically to erase everything human from the landscape. He was riding the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines before the worst of the winter came, when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a shadow, some trick of the falling snow and the failing light. But shapes didn't move like that. Shadows didn't collapse against the rocks the way this figure had. Daniel turned his horse directly into wind and rode toward the shape, already knowing he was going to be too late. She was Apache, that much was clear from her clothing. Traditional dress unsuited to this elevation, unsuited to this weather. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin already taking on the translucent quality that came from bodies beginning to shut down. Daniel lifted her without ceremony and positioned her in front of him on the horse, her weight almost negligible. He rode directly back to the cabin, abandoning his fence-checking mission. The cabin was warm. He left the fire burning deliberately, knowing he'd be outside for hours. He laid her on his bed and began the careful work of getting her out of her wet clothes without exposing her to more cold. He wrapped her in every blanket he possessed, positioned her near the fire, and waited for her to either wake up or die. For 6 hours, she hovered somewhere between. When her eyes opened, they were filled with fear and confusion in equal measure. "Easy," Daniel said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You collapsed in the snow about a mile from my property. I brought you here. You're warm now. You're going to be all right." The woman tried to speak, but her throat produced only a croak. Daniel brought her water, helping her drink slowly, watching as she regained enough physical awareness to understand she was alive. "My name is Daniel Cross," he said. "I live here. You're safe." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. "I shouldn't be alive," she whispered. "I should have died out there." Something in the way she said it, with resignation, with a kind of peace about non-existence, made Daniel understand that this woman hadn't gotten lost by accident. She'd walked into that blizzard deliberately. For 3 days, the woman remained in his cabin. Daniel learned her name was Takoda, that she was from a Navajo nation, that she'd been living on the reservation with a family she no longer wanted to acknowledge. She didn't volunteer much information, and Daniel didn't push. But slowly, through careful conversations and patient listening, her story emerged. She had been promised to a man, a marriage arranged by both families, meant to unite 2 branches of their people. But Takoda had loved someone else, a man named Michael, a cowboy who'd worked in the borderlands between Apache and white territories. They'd met secretly for 2 years, had fallen completely and utterly in love. Michael had asked her to run away with him. He'd promised a life away from the reservation, away from tradition, away from the expectations that were suffocating her. Takoda had been about to accept when Michael had been killed by soldiers. Not in combat, just in one of those random moments of frontier violence, where a man was in the wrong place at the wrong time. After he died, Takoda said on the 3rd night, sitting by the fire, everything became unbearable. They still wanted me to marry the other man. They still wanted me to accept my duty. But I couldn't. I couldn't marry someone when my heart had already chosen. So I left. I walked out into the storm deliberately. I wanted to disappear. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I'm glad you didn't," he said finally. Takoda looked at him, and something in her expression shifted slightly. "Why? You don't know me. I'm a stranger, a burden." "Because you have value," Daniel said simply. "Because your life matters. Because a woman who loves that fiercely, that completely, that woman deserves to live, not to disappear." By the 4th day, the blizzard had passed, and the landscape outside the cabin was transformed into something beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Takoda was strong enough to move around the cabin, to help with small tasks, to begin the process of understanding that survival was possible. Daniel expected her to want to leave, to return to the reservation, or to attempt a journey to wherever she imagined she could build a new life. Instead, she asked to stay. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. And I don't want to go back to the reservation, where my family will try to erase what Michael and I had and force me into a marriage I never wanted. I could go to a town, try to find work. But towns don't treat Apache women kindly. No, Daniel agreed. They don't. But you could stay here. Not as charity, not as obligation, but as a partner. I could use help with the ranch. You could build something for yourself. You could decide what you want your life to be. Takoda looked at him with an expression that suggested she was still learning to trust that kindness was possible. Why would you do that? Because I recognize a strong person when I see one, Daniel said, and because loneliness is a poor way to live, and I've been lonely for a very long time. She stayed. Over the following weeks, Takoda transformed the ranch in ways Daniel had never anticipated. She brought knowledge of the land, understanding of animals, capability that matched or exceeded his own. She worked beside him without complaint, without the resentment that often came from frontier women forced into labor. She worked because she wanted to build something. And slowly, almost without recognizing it was happening, Daniel fell in love with her. It wasn't the desperate, consuming passion that Takoda had experienced with Michael. It was something deeper, a recognition, a partnership, a sense that they were building something real together. Takoda, meanwhile, seemed to be healing. The haunted quality in her eyes gradually shifted to something more alive, more present. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of crimson and gold, Daniel asked her something he'd been considering for weeks. What was Michael like? He asked. The man you loved? Takoda was quiet for a moment, and there was no pain in her expression, just memory, just a gentle acknowledgement of something that had been real and true and was now in the past. He was kind, she said. He believed I was worthy of love. He didn't try to make me smaller or more acceptable. He loved me as I was. She paused. He would want me to be happy, to live fully, to build something good. Then I'm going to ask you something, Daniel said, not as a question born from desperation, or because I think you owe me anything, but as a genuine offer. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Not to replace what you had with Michael, but as something new, something equal, something chosen. Takoda turned to face him, and her expression was thoughtful. I'm not the woman Michael loved, she said. I'll never be her again. I've been broken in ways I'm still discovering. I know, Daniel said, and I'm not asking you to be her. I'm asking you to be Takoda, the woman who walked into a blizzard and survived it, who's rebuilding herself with intelligence and courage, who makes this ranch better just by being here. Then yes, Takoda said. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married in a small ceremony at the cabin, with the preacher from the nearest town traveling 3 days to perform the ceremony. Takoda wore a dress she'd sewn herself, a blending of Apache traditional patterns with frontier practicality. Daniel wore the suit his mother had given him decades ago, a garment he'd never expected to use. When they exchanged vows, they did so as equals, two people who'd each learned what it meant to survive alone, and who'd chosen to build something together. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people accepted the marriage. Others were scandalized by the union of a white man and a Navajo woman. But Daniel had spent enough years on the frontier to understand that some opinions didn't matter. What mattered was what existed between him and Takoda. Genuine partnership, mutual respect, the kind of love that was built on understanding rather than passion alone. 5 years after finding Takoda collapsed in the snow, the ranch had become something unexpected. Daniel had expanded the operation, and Takoda had become known throughout the territory as a woman of exceptional capability, someone who understood horses, cattle, and land management in ways that rivaled or exceeded most men's knowledge. More importantly, she had become a voice for Apache people in the region, using her position as Daniel's wife to advocate for fair treatment, for respect, for the recognition that indigenous people had value beyond how useful they were to settlers. They'd established a school on the ranch where Apache children learned both their traditional knowledge and frontier practical skills. They created a sanctuary where women and children fleeing abusive situations could find shelter and rebuilding resources. The woman who'd walked into a blizzard intending to disappear had instead become a force for systemic change. On the anniversary of the day Daniel found her collapsed in the snow, they returned to that location. Takoda stood at the rocks where she'd fallen, and her expression held complexity. Gratitude, memory, the acknowledgement of what might have been lost. "I was ready to die," she said quietly. "I thought disappear was the only way to escape the expectations, the pain, the life that had been determined for me without my choice." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now," Takoda said, "I understand that survival was the brave choice. That rebuilding was the revolutionary act. That choosing partnership with someone who respected my agency was far more powerful than I could have imagined." Daniel took her hand, and together they stood in a location where everything had changed. The blizzard that had been meant to erase her had instead delivered her to a place where she could truly begin. The mountain man who'd found a collapsed woman in the snow and had brought her to safety had given her more than just shelter. He'd given her the space and respect to become herself. He'd treated her not as a burden or a rescued victim, but as a partner equal to himself. And Takoda, the woman who'd been broken by grief and loss, had discovered that life after despair was possible. That love didn't have to look like the consuming passion she'd experienced with Michael. That partnership could be built on respect, equality, and mutual choosing. The snow that had nearly killed her had instead brought her to a man who would spend the rest of his life believing in her strength, supporting her vision, and standing beside her as she transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she touched. Sometimes the greatest rescues aren't the dramatic ones. They're the quiet moments when someone sees your worth and simply believes in it completely. When someone offers you a choice and respects whatever you decide. When someone recognizes that you are not broken beyond healing, but rather, as Takoda had become, capable of building something extraordinary. That was the love story of the mountain man and the Apache woman. Not one of passion alone, but partnership, respect, and the revolutionary understanding that sometimes the person who saved your life is simply the one who believes you were worth saving in the first place.